Welcome everybody to December 11th, 2018 Ask the Experts webinar. Today we're going to be joined by Kouthar Waled from, actually currently from the University of Waterloo, but ex of Team 772. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about coding and some of her experiences in anticipation of us getting going in like 3 weeks or so. Anyways. As always, if you have any questions during the course of the webinar about this and anything else, you can please put them in the questions box and we'll get to them as we go along. We'd certainly appreciate any questions that you might have. And again, as always, this is being recorded and the recording will be put on the First Canada YouTube channel, the Ask the Experts playlist. And we will send out that link in case you don't have it at the end of the evening after it's been uploaded through our First Canada Facebook page. Just another aside, next week we're going to be talking more in depth about the kickoff. There's a bunch of things that teams probably should be doing that they'll need to do in advance of that. And we'll talk a little bit about some of that today, but most of it will be Kouthar and telling us about Java and coding. But once again, any questions, please ask. So Kouthar, without further ado, it's over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. As Paul mentioned, I'm Kouthar Waled. I'm a student at the University of Waterloo, and I am studying computer science. I was on FRC Team 772 as a student, and I also mentored 6875 in my final year. It's my pleasure to be here, and honestly, feel free to ask any questions. I'm completely open to answering them. So to start off, what is new with the FRC Java environment? This also holds for the C++ environment. We changed IDEs from last year from Eclipse to VS Code, and it's quite different from what we're used to. VS Code has this thing called the command palette, and a lot of your applications of how to make files and do other things comes from command palette. It's accessed in a different way, and it's not like the traditional go to the top bar, click on new file, new whatever. So it does take a little bit of getting used to. Plugins are also installed slightly differently. It's more straightforward than it was in the past, so it is an easy switch there. Eclipse also had an import shortcut, Command-Shift-O or Control-Shift-O, depending on your OS, but VS Code does not have that handy built-in shortcut. So unless you can figure out how to have a shortcut for imports, you are going to have to manually type out your imports. I think it's important to manually type out your imports, or at least import things one thing at a time, because a problem with automatic imports that happened a bit last year with Eclipse was that Eclipse would choose your imports automatically for you. And sometimes when Java had a built-in timer, for example, it would use the Java timer instead of the WPLib timer, and you would run into issues there, and you wouldn't be able to find the bug as easily because you didn't realize that you had the wrong import. Button layout is also a bit different. The way that you run, build, deploy your code is located on a different section of the pane on VS Code. The user interface is also pretty different. It's newer looking. I think it's prettier, and it has an automatic dark theme, which is pretty exciting. So overall, it is a bit of a weird transition, and it'll take a little bit of getting used to, but once you get used to it, it's honestly better, I think, than Eclipse. It's definitely more modern, and there are some things that are more convenient, take less clicking to get done. And now, why Java? Why did our team choose Java, for example? Well, there are a lot of perks to choosing Java. The two languages that are supported directly by FIRST are C++ and Java. And both Java and C++ have their own perks. For example, you might be using a third-party sensor or a third-party camera, and if that third-party device uses only C++ and is only supported by C++, it might be better for you to use C++ as the base of your robot code as well, just so that you don't run into any issues in terms of different languages that are used. However, Java is way more widely used than C++ is. So at competitions, you'll be able to help more teams, and you will be able to receive help from more teams because more teams use Java. There are also some third-party devices as well that only have Java as a supported language, but for the most part, especially with FRC, unless you venture really far off into using third-party devices, Java is really heavily supported. So if you're looking for simplicity and you're looking for support or to support others, it's incredibly useful to use Java. There are also other languages that you can use, like LabVIEW and Python. LabVIEW is a bit, it's sort of dying off. There are still teams who use it, but it's incredibly rare to find more than 3 or 4 teams per smaller competition that use LabVIEW. So if you're using LabVIEW and you get into a bit of a pickle, it is much more difficult to troubleshoot because you may not be able to get that support that you need. And then for Python, Python has little to no support directly from WPLib, which are the libraries that we use for Java and C++. So troubleshooting and receiving help from other teams will be incredibly difficult because you don't have the same support, even online, like on Chief Delphi, that you would be able to get with Java or even C++. Next, iterative versus command-based. What is the difference? Which one makes the most sense? What to choose if you don't have a coding background, and where to find help if needed. So what is the difference? I think it's important to note that command-based foundation is iterative robot. Robot.java, for example, is the only file that you'll find in an iterative project, but it is also a class in command-based. And that's because robot.java sort of forms the base of the environment, so for scheduling reasons and things like that. The main difference then is that command-based has a framework built on top of robot.java. So it has a layer of sort of generalization for different commands and subsystems and really helps with organization. There are different perks to iterative and command-based. Iterative gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of doing quote-unquote spooky things. So I know of teams who flip through robot.java classes using an array and who sort of create their own schedulers and their own types of commands just the way that they please, and that is the flexibility that iterative gives you. However, if you aren't incredibly experienced with that sort of programming, then command-based gives you a lot of the scheduling and gives you a lot of the basis for making your robot work. So it gives you an order of operations, for example, for your commands, and gives you a place to store information for your subsystems. It's much more organized, and you really get an idea of how commands and processes work in the template basically that they give you for commands and subsystems. You also have this handy thing called a command group in command base, which allows you to stitch together different commands, which is often incredibly helpful in autonomous programming, and even if you have a more complicated process for one of your subsystems. So there are definitely pros and cons for either one, but command-based really is better if you aren't wildly experienced with creating your own abstract functions because it's more organized. It gives you a lot more structure when it comes to creating programs. And when it comes to troubleshooting, things sort of follow the same steps, the same format, the same timing. So you get pretty good at pointing out different patterns that you see when it comes to errors and debugging. For which one makes the most sense, it really depends again on how much experience that you have. But for the majority of teams, when I have helped people out in the past, what they did with iterative robot really could have been more efficiently and more organizedly done in command-based. Iterative robot honestly is only better if you're really utilizing that flexibility. If you're not utilizing that flexibility, then command-based makes more sense because it's more organized and it does a lot of the work for you. I kind of went over this already, but if you don't have a coding background on the team, then it's probably better to start off with command-based because it really gives you a huge template to start working off of for creating your robot. If you need help, then you can reach out to First Robotics Canada, other robotics teams in your vicinity, and Chief Delphi is also a really awesome forum to go and ask questions. People are super active on there, so it's really likely that your question will be answered. Now, oh, and my segment is done. If there are any questions, let me know.
So, Kouthar, one question that I did want to put out there was if you are doing a command-based program, is it easier than the next year to incorporate some of those methods into your new robot?
Technically, you aren't allowed to use past year's code in your current year's robot unless you publish it publicly. But it does serve as a really useful reference when you're going forward. So because you're using a template, it provides a lot of self-documentation, and you know what certain methods do, and you know what certain things do, regardless of whether you understand what's inside the function that you built yourself is. So it's easier to sort of refresh your memory and look at what's going on and to be able to put that on your new robot. Because it's more structured, it's easier to transfer the same logic and to transfer the same type of code, or the same code even, to a new robot than it is for if you use iterative, because with iterative you have more control over what you're doing, but at the same time that may mean that you forget something, or something is done in a way that you won't be able to implement in the next year's robot. So command-based structure really helps you be able to transfer things year to year. Yeah.
So one thing I have seen with some teams that are young teams that do iterative is that they have all the code. It's in just that one class, and there are problems with that. Correct?
Yes. Yes, this is what I mentioned earlier when I said that when I saw other teams using iterative, they had the same code that they could be using more efficiently and more organizedly and command base. The problem with just straight up using iterative robot and sticking everything in robot.java is that because absolutely everything is in the same class, debugging becomes really messy because you're looking through more stuff. When you stick everything into robot, you don't have as much of a structure when it comes to scheduling, so it's more likely that you will have an error in your logic or an error in what you're doing, and you will not get the result that you want. The nice thing about command base is that it really controls when things are called, where things are called, and how often they're called. so that you have fewer chances of running into scheduling issues or conflicts in what you're sending to motors and stuff like that.
Which one would be better if or easier to do in autonomous mode, in your opinion?
In my opinion, for most teams, I think it would be easier to use command-based, just because like I said, command-based really gives you sort of your own template for scheduling a command, and it gives you command groups, which is really nice. So the nice thing about scheduling a command is that you have a few methods, one that runs immediately, one that runs over and over again until a check returns true, and then once the check returns true, it ends it. So that's a really nice template to work off of because it's really straightforward, and you have a more straightforward way of thinking about autonomous. And then if you need to do a lot of different movements, then it's really easy to stitch together commands in command groups, which is really nice. Again, if you are a more advanced team or you've been working with command-based for a really long time and you think that it restricts you, it could be time for you to move on to iterative robot, because iterative robot does give you a lot more flexibility because you are ultimately way more in control of what you're writing. And that control can either be detrimental because it's harder to get a hold of what you're doing, or it could help you a lot because then you are able to do more quote-unquote what you want.
So we have a question, Kouthar, from Peter.
Okay.
He wants to know, he says, when you say command, you mean using object-oriented programming versus iterative, which is not. Is that an accurate interpretation?
Yes, you can still use object-oriented programming in iterative. It's just a lot more work. So command-based programming really takes into account heavily the object-oriented programming, and command-based programming is surrounded by object-oriented programming, so its purpose is object-oriented, while iterative can be used, you can use it surrounded by object-oriented mindset, I guess, but it's way more up to you to make it object-oriented, and it's a lot more work.
One of the things, the key things that Kouthar has mentioned, and we mention it a lot when we talk to teams about coding, is that regardless of what you think of the language you want to do, at some point in that season, you're going to need help. Whether you're doing Java, LabVIEW, C++, or teams that are talking about Python, you will need some help. So one of the reasons that people, you heard Kouthar's reasons for choosing it, but very often one of the reasons that teams choose a particular language is because they do have support. So for example, 4343 is doing LabVIEW because they have a mentor that works for NI and has a background in it. And 4001, when they first started, they did LabVIEW because their mentors, their engineering mentors from Kwanzaa Inc., they worked also with NI, and they had a great foundation in LabVIEW. If you no matter which language you use, there's going to be coming a point in the season where you need some help. And as Kouthar has explained, if it's Java, there are far more people, far more teams in Ontario for sure, and probably throughout all of FIRST, who have that background that can help you. I guess one of the things that, from what I'm hearing, Kouthar, is that if someone comes over to help you and you're a new team and you're doing iterative and all your coding is in the one class, it may take a little bit of time for that person to figure out exactly what you've done, to figure out where the debugging might be a little more challenging than if it was done in the command-based. Is that a fair assessment?
That is definitely a fair assessment. Because you're putting everything into one class, oftentimes, especially if you're a beginner, and we've all been there, it's not a cheap shot, but a lot of times there's some sort of spooky stuff happening with where you cancel some code, or things are scheduled a bit weirdly, and that can really be avoided, and your code can be much easier to understand, and it could also be better for next year's because it's easier for you to understand a year later because you forget what you did if it's all organized, which command-based helps you do.
Well, that's a great intro for sure to those people that are thinking about different coding languages to use. We did get a couple of you had a nice compliment there, Kouthar, from one of the mentors who's an IT professional. Um, Commented that you really did get it. We had
Oh,
one,
thank you so much.
which is why you're on here, because you're an expert. But we do have another question from Peter. So he
Sure.
says the classes provided give access to the various functions on the RoboRio. Is there also a class or drive station to respond to the drive station command E? For example, move forward, joystick forward. I would use a joystick listener that would in turn invoke RoboRio actions. Is that right?
So if you look at the WPLib website, then you can actually find something called Smart Dashboard. And Smart Dashboard, whether you use the LabVIEW Smart Dashboard or the Java Smart Dashboard, is a really awesome tool when it comes to using your dashboard to do things. So a lot of times people will choose their autonomous modes from their dashboard, or they'll keep an eye on sensor values on their dashboard. They'll change speeds on their dashboard, and it's really an awesome tool to use if you are looking into it. But yeah, Smart Dashboard is awesome. Our team has used it a lot, and a lot of teams do use that. And the nice thing about the Java Smart Dashboard is once you figure it out, I've seen teams do some really amazing things with it. They sort of create their own selection table, for example, for autonomous modes, so they can select where they're positioned on the team, what alliance there are, and which auto mode that they want to do. And based off of their code on their project, they'll be able to easily choose an autonomous mode that does exactly what they need, rather than have to select manually through 18 different autonomous modes. So Smart Dashboard is an awesome tool, and you can utilize it so well.
So just to quickly review that point, so where would somebody who has never seen the Smart Dashboard, where would they find that?
That is on the WPLib website. And when our team started using Smart Dashboard, we did a lot of Googling. A lot of teams have some really awesome stuff on Chief Delphi. I think it's really awesome to use Chief Delphi as a source, because sometimes when WPLib doesn't have the same documentation, people will post their code on Chief Delphi. And even if there's a problem later on in the code, the base of the code is often really awesome. And from there, you can really figure out where to go.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question from Yaman. I hope I pronounced that correctly. About the VS Code switch, I don't fully know why it happened this year, but are there any major changes that we should be aware of if we haven't looked at it yet? I know there are the changes that you had mentioned in terms of building and deploying code, but I wouldn't say those are major.
No. I honestly don't think there are major changes. If there were major changes, they would make them in other applications, like for the imaging application that you use. But the IDE honestly is just a tool for you to create the code. So there isn't, and VS Code is really just your run-of-the-mill IDE. So there aren't any major changes other than the ones that I already mentioned. So any giant changes in terms of software would be separate of your IDE.
Right, and I think as well that I know of teams, and it says it in the Screen Steps Live part on the first website, that you can take code from last year that you created in Eclipse, and you can bring that code in into VS Code. And I know of teams that have done that. I think 5596 has done that amongst others. So that should indicate that there aren't really any major changes to it. I'll tell you, having tried to download both many times, it is so much faster to get VS Code installed and up and going and creating your first program and deploying it than it was with Eclipse. It's that's incredible.
That's why I like VS Code a lot more. It's kind of superficial, but it's really pretty. It's way prettier than Eclipse, and it's much easier, much faster to get set up. Another thing is if there were any major changes to the actual libraries themselves, they would make an announcement about those. So last year, the major change to the libraries was that the Talon SRX were no longer directly supported from WPLib, but you had to sort of import it as a third party from the Crossroad Electronics website, and that is continuing this into this year, I believe. So any changes in terms of library would be announced, but none of those have been announced thus far as I know. So there shouldn't be any big changes, and none of them would be directly linked to VS Code. They'd all be library changes.
I think maybe, thank you for doing this, Kouthar, but I think maybe when we all come back during the build season, maybe a future one of these would be on one that you're doing on the smart dashboard so everybody could see exactly what some of the benefits are. Or perhaps if, since you're at university, maybe not working with a particular team, that perhaps that might be something that you can work with another team as well.
Okay.
To do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's another one from Peter. I'm not sure if this one applies to you, but computers in our school are locked down, in quotes. I can relate to that. Can VS Code be installed without the need for admin access, or could VS Code be installed and run from a memory stick? I'll say first that, Peter, this is not an unusual thing. Most teams will want to have their own team laptop that is not a school laptop, in the sense that it's not been had stuff installed on it by the IT department in the school or on the board. That can be difficult to find that, but that is a challenge for sure.
Mm-hmm. It really depends on the school board, honestly. For our school board, for the longest time, we could download things directly off of the internet and open them. And then recently that changed. So it honestly depends. I would check with your own computers and download Eclipse and see if it runs. And then I would, if it does run, not Eclipse, sorry, VS Code, and see if it runs. And then if it does run, I would go ahead, shut down the computer, turn it back on. Because sometimes what the computers do is, if it's not pre-installed and approved by the school, then it will automatically erase that application. Another thing I would do too, if it doesn't erase that application after you turn it back on, is to log into the same user but on a different computer. Because sometimes when you download an application and it stays, it only gets saved locally onto the actual computer and not underneath the user. So if your issue might be that you need to install it on literally every single computer to ensure that absolutely every computer can access it. But your issue might also be that it deletes itself every time you shut down, or that it won't open at all.
So I've pasted a link in the chat to everybody. So there's a chat box if you haven't noticed it. You should have just seen a link come in from Rob Spearin from Programming Mentor, among other things, from Team 6514 out of Sutton District High, that may solve some of that problem. I haven't looked at it myself, but if Rob says it'll work, I trust him on that one. In any case, lots of stuff. This has been amongst the most, the biggest number of questions that we've had in a little bit. So thank you for sparking some interest. Of course, it may be that we're getting so close to the kickoff that everybody's starting to sweat, but hopefully that's not it. So thank you, Kouthar. I appreciate that. So I'm going to just take over the screen again.
No problem.
And I want to take a look at this thing that we were talking about in terms of our kickoff. So just to quickly go through a couple of things in advance of our webinar next week about the kickoff. Among other things we're going to talk about is what happens at a kickoff. Should my team go? What are the alternatives? What should we be doing the first week of the build season, and what's happening in the future that's going to be different about the kickoff? So one of the things that has happened is that we have a kickoff now at Studica, even though we had one last year, but this one was in response to requests that we had from teams that they just wanted to pick up their kit of parts. They didn't want to stay to see They didn't want to see the video release, and you can't pick up the kit parts until after that has occurred. But so there's quite a number of teams that are picking it up at the Studica warehouse, which is the first Canada warehouse as well. Our stuff is hosted there by Studica. The reason for that has been that many teams are now pretty far away from the original Kickoff, which was at the Science Center, and then later on, as it is now, at Crescent School. Maybe I'm not showing my screen here. That should do it now. Anyways, what we're trying to be as responsive as we can. The numbers of teams are just increasing, and it's harder to have things all in one place. So now we have satellite kickoffs. And part of that is for networking. Part of that is also to try to do some kind of a quick build if we can as well for teams that are new teams, rookie teams, or first-year teams if they're not a rookie team. So basically at a kickoff, there's some video presentations. Then there's the release of the game, followed by the password that will allow you to decrypt all the stuff that you have downloaded prior to that, so that you can see the rules, you can see all the information about the specs for your robot and so forth. So there's lots of stuff. So many teams now are hosting. So for example, I think St. Max and Aurora is one I know of, 4343. They're going to pick up their kits at, I think it's Crescent, it doesn't really matter. And then they're going to all be meeting at St. Max, and they've invited some other schools, some rookie schools from nearby, be with them to do inventory of their kit of parts, and then to do a bunch of things like brainstorming as a group. So that's one of the things that they're thinking is important. So there's a bunch of things like that you could do. One of the things I'll mention is that because all the kickoffs are official first events, at every official first event, each team that shows up must bring a roster. That's the team list of mentors and students that is presented, that is available in the dashboard of lead mentor, coach 1 or 2. And that's where you also would go in your dashboard to invite mentors to be on your team and students. And we'll send something out about that in a day or two when I make up that video to show you how to do that if you haven't done that. If you have a veteran team that's working with you, they can show you how to do that. One of the reasons for making sure that they're done electronically, although that's not possible for everyone, is that most awards that are submitted, award submissions, applications that you can put in prior to going to an event, have to be done by students. And the only people that can submit, and they have to be submitted online, and the only way that you can do that is to check off that this particular student on your team or that particular student is an award submitter, that they can then submit the award. So that's one of the reasons why it has to be in the roster. So we will definitely go through something about that. That is as much as I have for today, but I did see a couple of questions that popped up at the end. So these 3 questions are from Keon. Will FRC 2019 be out of the code alpha test before kickoff? Well, I hope so. I don't have any inside information on that. I would imagine it is. It will be, because they're saying the Eclipse is not being supported. So I would assume that will be the case. But like I say, I don't have any particular information on that, only what I've seen on the first site. And Java Development Kit 11 is only available in 64-bit on Oracle's website. Will WPI-lib be releasing a 32-bit build for FRC 2019? Again, I don't know. I have no first-hand information about that. That might be one question that, as Kouthar said, a good resource is Chief Delphi, is to go to that site. If you search Chief Delphi, you should find it, and they may have some more information about that. Some of those people seem to have a little bit more of an in than a lowly first senior mentor in Ontario does. And how do teams deal with version control FRC events with a lack of network connection? Well, most of the version control will be done in advance. the taking your robot to an event. There may be some coding going on at the event for a bunch of teams, especially if it doesn't work, but there would not be typically a lot of high-level major changes being made. But you know, you're going to have to have some of that stuff on USB and on laptops and be able to find a network connection. Most of the FRC events, you will have access to some network connections. They just won't be close to the field. So, for example, sometimes in the pits, if the pits are not right beside the field, and some of the venues they are right beside the field, and you don't have that access. Other ones that are a little further apart, you might have easier access to a network. But it's hit and miss. That's part of the planning, I guess, that would go into it. But I know I didn't answer those questions probably to your satisfaction, Keon. I just don't have that kind of information with me today. In any case, our last slide for today is getting ready for kickoff, where we'll talk about more of these things next week. If you do have any questions that come up after you've left and the webinar is over, or you're watching the webinar through the First Canada YouTube channel, you are more than welcome to send me questions at pkeenan@firstinspires.org. If I don't know the answer, like for Keon's, I will try to find the answers. So please feel free to contact me with anything that you might have. And if you're not with us next week, or you're in school or you're in Waterloo doing some exams, good luck with those. And
Thank you.
Happy holidays to everybody for the holiday season coming up. I hope everybody has a relaxing time right before kickoff and the build season, because we all know there's not much time to relax during that period of time. And we'll see how this last year of Stop Build Day or Bag and Tag goes. And I wish everybody luck and best wishes for the new year. So thank you once again, Kouthar. And
thank you for having me.
And to everybody who participated in listening, thank you as well. Good night.